All right, everybody, welcome to lecture number 5. It is a pleasure to have everyone here. And I'm going to start where we left off, but this time in the Friedlander. I'm going to post a link here. Give me a second. It's in the Sefaria. If you go to Guide for the Perplexed, the prefatory remarks, it's paragraph 8 in the prefatory remarks in the introduction. So, and here, give me 1 second. And
the Pine citation.
I will give you exactly where in that chapter in a minute, but I'm going to give the link in the chat. Okay, there's the link. Now, if you when you get into paragraph 8, it's in the middle of the paragraph, and we are up to the words that start in our commentary on the Mishnah. It's a very long paragraph, and it's not broken up, and I apologize for that, but I had nothing to do with that. That's just the way they set it up. It starts with, in our commentary on the Mishnah, we stated our intention. That's where we're up to. Just to review real quick, the Rambam just explained to us why the Torah and the rabbis throughout Chazal, throughout the Talmud and the Mishnah and Medrash had to speak in metaphors, so that people that are less educated will understand it on their level, and people that are more educated will understand it on their level. And that kind of sums up very, very briefly what we discussed last time. Today, we are going to, before I actually read where I just told you we're going to start from, I have a lot of things to say that we'll find very interesting, so that we can understand what the Rambam is about to say. If you have the Pines, then you should open to page 9 in the first volume. And the paragraph starts, "We had promised in the commentary on the Mishnah." That's where we would be up to in the Pines. And I don't know if anyone's following in the Hebrew kapach, but if you are, it would be on page Ches, where it says, "Ukvar az hiftachnu." We have promised to perish our Mishnah. So, beginning those first few words that I just read, I like the Pine translation. We had promised in the commentary on the Mishnah that we would explain strange subjects in the book of prophecy and in the book of correspondence. The translation is a little different than you'll see in the Friedlander, but that's just the nature of what we're doing. So what did he promise exactly? The Rambam promised to us that he would write a book, but he did write 2 books, but he didn't write them. Now, I want to say the Rambam was famous for a lot of his writings. One of his most major and most important writings was the Mishnah Torah, which basically is the Rambam's grand and largely successful attempt at organizing the entire body of Jewish law. The Rambam was really, to say that he's really good at it is quite an understatement, at taking everything and organizing it and setting it up in a very comprehensive, clear way, so that pretty much the entire corpus of Talmudic law is summarized and categorized and broken down in law. The Rambam, when he wrote his Perush on the Mishnah, in Sanhedrin, he made a promise that he was going to write 2 other books, which is what he's referring to here by the sentence I just read. And what are those 2 books? In the Rambam's Perush Mishnah on Tractate Sanhedrin, chapter 10, Mishnah 1, he writes as follows: "Va'ani asid lechaber chibur." I am going to write one day a writing in which esof bo kol hadrashos. I am going to gather in there all of the drashas, the derivations, all of the explanations hanimsot b'Talmud that are found throughout the entire Talmud. Ve'avareim, and I will explain them. Ve'asbireim, and I will describe them. Hezber matim la'emes, a description and an explanation which is the truth, or close to the truth. And I will prove every time I explain something that Chazal says, that the rabbis say, I'm going to prove that from their own words that what my explanations are correct. And I will reveal in this book which ones what we're supposed to understand according to its simple outward meaning, and which ones are really just parables, and which ones are really referring to dreams but didn't really happen. But despite it having actually happened in a dream, it was described in simple language, as if it's as if it happened when the person was awake. So I'm going to describe to you many ideas. And so on and so forth. So he goes, and then he goes on to explain that and don't worry about the fact that I might have to reveal things that were otherwise hidden. And he goes on. So he made this promise. And in another place in Sanhedrin, which I'm not going to read, he makes a promise that he's going to do the same thing for Tanakh, right? So these two books that he just referred to in the sentence I read in the Guide for the Perplexed are two books that he started writing, but never finished. And unfortunately, we don't have even what he started. I can hardly imagine how. I mean, it's quite a shame that he didn't write them. So the two books are as follows. I just want to make this clear to try to understand what he was about to set out to do. Because what we're going to find out when we read further in the Moreh Nevuchim, we're going to find out that he stopped. He's going to explain us why he stopped writing those books. And instead, he gave us this book, which we're beginning to read together, the Guide of the Perplexed, which is set up very differently. It was going to be a comprehensive study of all of the statements of Chazal, all of the statements of the rabbis, everything we find in the Mishnah and the Talmud, everything that's written, and it seems really difficult to understand, either because it scientifically doesn't make sense or philosophically there's issues or theological problems with a lot of it. And he was going to explain it all. And if the Rambam does something like that, he would have done it in the same way he handled the body of law, which was extremely comprehensive, extremely well organized, and so on. And so he was going to do that for Chazal, for the rabbi sayings, and he was going to do that for the entire Tanakh, every verse which says something in it. And he would have done this in his own way, his organized way of going through every single prophecy and explaining what is meant to be taken literally, what it really means, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, we don't have this book. Now, before we read further, I thought, and I'm going to do this throughout our lectures because it's taking us a long time to get through his preface to the introduction. So I'm going to give you tastes and flavors for the kinds of things that he's referring to from later in the book. So we get a sense for what when he introduces something here, what he's talking about, how he's going to handle it later. So we can have a lot of fun with this. So I decided I was going to choose two things, which probably would have been in the Rambam's book, his organized book. And I'm going to show you how he dealt with it in the Guide for the Perplexed in a very deliberately disorganized way, and how he kind of left it in a way that you have to work to figure it out. And you have to read here, there, piece it all together. And then all of a sudden, bam, you understand what he meant. So I'm going to take it one chazal, one saying of the rabbis, which is extremely difficult for a whole host of reasons, very difficult to understand. I'm going to show you how the Rambam treats it by picking a whole bunch of places within the Moreh Nevuchim, and we're going to put it all together, and we're going to come up with a grand understanding of how the Rambam explains it. And then I'm also going to do the same thing, but a little bit shorter when I do from some of the where he does that with the prophecy from a book in Tanakh. So here we go. For those of us that studied the might remember, it wasn't that long ago, maybe a year and a half ago, I can't remember, where we learned the tractate Shabbat, right? For those that are been along. And in Shabbat, there's a Gemara there, which is very, very challenging on a whole lot of levels. And I'll read it, and then I want to hear from you all what's challenging to you about this and what's difficult about this particular thing that the Rambam is saying. Now, the here goes. So the first one, here goes. We're on Shabbat 146a. Okay, that's Kuf Mem Vav Amud Aleph. The Gemara asks the question, and this trigger alert. This may trigger very difficult feelings in many of us. So here we go. Mipnei ma goyim mizuhamin. Why are Gentiles contaminated? And mizuham is a word usually used for something disgusting. It's a vulgar kind of word. Why are the Gentiles contaminated? So it says because Shelo Amdu al Har Sinai, they weren't there on Har Sinai. They weren't there at Sinai. Why? What happened? What did Har Sinai have to do with it? Sheba Nachash al Chava, because the snake had sexual relations with Chava, and when he did that with Eve, right? When he did that, this disgusting contamination went into Chava, and she passed that on to all of her progeny afterwards. So all of humanity has this zuham, whatever that contamination. Yisrael she'amdu al Har Sinai, the people of Israel that stood at Sinai, at Sinai they were cleansed of this contamination. Goyim, the other nations, the Gentiles, shelo amdu al Har Sinai, that did not stand at Sinai, lo paska zuhamasan. Their contamination did not go away. And just to finish this little piece, Amar le Rav Acha brei Rav Ashi. So Rabbi Acha, the son of Rabbah, said to Rabbi Ashi, Gerimai, what about converts? If they weren't at Sinai, so Amar le, he says, Apagav to inu lo havu, even though they may not physically have been standing there, their spirit was there at Sinai. So a person that converts to Judaism, so this last part is often quoted in context because it's easy.
So when you're talking and you get away like this, when you go down like this, we lose you.
Oh, okay.
When you're going down like this, we lose your voice.
All right, thanks for bringing that up. I'll be careful not to shuckle. Anyway, so this last part is quoted a lot, that converts were also at Sinai in spirit. You can make something nice out of that. But the first part has difficulties, a lot of difficulties. Now tell me, tell me a few things difficult that bother you about this piece, and be totally, you're allowed to bring it up. There's no disrespect in bringing up what bothers you about this piece.
It's terrible. We live in a Gentile world, and we intentionally insult them and make life more difficult for the Jewish people by taking that position that the Gentiles are so far off the mark and that they're apparently poisonous.
Very good. So it's very discriminatory, to say the least, against Gentiles, and it says, like, saying that there's something physically contaminated about them, right? So that's very hard to chew on for a lot of reasons. It should be, if it's not obvious, then find another class and go somewhere else. But okay.
I don't know. Sex with a snake kind of got my attention.
Okay, yeah. So making it into a sexual encounter, like what's up with that? How that's very good. So that's another thing. The Bible, the Torah doesn't say anything about the snake having sex with Eve. So who imagines such a thing? That's a great point. Okay, what else bothers you about this piece?
Well, a Gentile is not metame.
Halachic problem there. So the rule is that a Gentile can't, even where there are cases, I'm going to elaborate on what you're saying, that where when we do have a concept of tumah, of contamination, of ritual contamination, it only applies to Jews, not to Gentiles. So halachically, it doesn't even make sense to say that a Gentile should be contaminated. So that's another issue. Okay, very good. Anyone else have some other problems?
Well, I don't know how the Gentiles could be at Sinai, given they weren't around at the time.
They didn't. What do you mean they didn't? They weren't. You can. They could have had a chance, right? There's a medrash that says that God offered the Torah to everybody, right? I don't know whether you take that literally or not. It's a different story. They could have come. I guess a lot of nations.
Yeah.
What? Sorry.
Yeah. I get that. I agree. I got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, any other issues that anyone could think of?
Maybe the contamination is not a physical problem, but a spiritual problem.
I think that's
the contamination. I'm not sure if that was.
That's probably the beginning of a potential answer to some of these problems, but the tip of the iceberg. But okay, I'll take that. Anyone else have what else bothers you about this? Because we brought up some really good ones. I could think of a couple more things that are bothersome though. I'll give you a hint. There's another religion that has something coming out of the sin of the a religion that's kind of popular.
You're talking about
original I'm talking about
sin.
Original sin. That's not supposed to be a Jewish concept, right? We're not supposed to be born with some kind of contamination, right? It runs against so much else in Chazal that it doesn't even warrant me going through it. So, like, we're born a clean slate. I mean, the Mishnah in Avot compares a child to a blank sheet, and we write our story of our lives. We make those choices. We're not born contaminated. So these are some of the major difficulties. So now I'm going to refer you to, so let's take a look if you can open, but it's going to be hard to find. So, but if you look at the Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim, Chelek Beis, that's the section 2, because it's divided into section 1, 2, and 3. Section 2, chapter 30, okay? And there, the Rambam discussing the sayings of the rabbis, the sayings of Chazal with relationship to Genesis. And he talks over there about a whole lot of things. And he mentions repeatedly, he talks about how when it says, what does it mean when it says God created them as a male and female? It sounds like they were together, and he brings different words from Chazal about that. And he talks about what does it mean a rib, that a woman was created from a rib, and how does that work? And then he brings a story which I want you to think about, right? He brings a story of the Nachash, of the snake, right? And he says, I'm going to read to you, this is, if you have the volume 2 of the Pines translation, this is page 356, the second paragraph. It's somewhere in the middle of section 230, but you'll have to scroll through a lot till you find it. So just, if you can't find it, just listen to what I say. Among the things you ought to know is the following explanation, which they gave in the Midrash. Another saying of the rabbi said, they mentioned that the serpent had a rider. There was someone riding on the serpent, and the serpent was the size of a camel, and it was the rider on the serpent who convinced Chava, Eve, to eat the fruit, and the rider was Samael, right? Samael is the name that the rabbis often use for Satan, for Satan. Okay, so therefore you will find that they say in a number of passages, the Rambam says, Chazal will say that Satan also wanted to tempt. For example, he brings places where Chazal used Satan or Samael as the one who tried to tempt someone to sin. And it talks about how he tried to tempt Abraham to not want to go and sacrifice Isaac, or other cases he brings. So I'm going to kind of skip through a little bit. But then he says as follows: among the amazing dicta, this is the Pines translation, whose external meaning is exceedingly incongruous, right? And if you look at the Hebrew version of this, I'll read that to you, because in other words, the Rambam is saying what he's about to quote, which is, I'm going to give you the giveaway, is what we just read in the Talmud, is exceedingly difficult to understand, right? It's really, really strange. I want to find the way the Rambam explains it in the Hebrew. It reads, "V'od min ha'amorot haniflaot asher peshutan betachlit hazorot," which is in the extremely strange, right? Is the following, right? It's, in other words, this is like on the surface, it makes no sense at all. However, when you obtain a true understanding of the chapters of what I'm writing to you, in other words, you have to go through this book, you will admire the wisdom of the parables and the correspondence to what exists. Is this following statement. And he quotes the Gemara that I just quoted to you about the snake having relations with Chava and the contamination. This too, you should follow up in your thought. Think about it, and you'll see how incredibly wise this is. So the Rambam but then he doesn't explain it. Then he goes on to another statement of Chazal, and he says this other one is also amazing. So this is the one that I chose to analyze, and I'm going to show you how the Rambam answers this. What does he mean? It's amazing. So the Rambam gives us the hints, and it takes a search. You have to search through the book, but luckily I did it for you. And I'm going to show you why the Rambam thinks that this extremely strange passage, which sounds difficult to comprehend on numerous levels, like we all noticed it right away, actually makes a lot of sense. So here goes. The first thing I want you to think about is the following. The Rambam actually, he dropped us hints because he told us that the Nachash was actually Samael, was the Satan. So now you need to say, well, where did the Rambam talk about who Satan is? What is Satan? What is that? He's some kind of an angel? We imagine all kinds of images in our mind of who Satan is, what Satan is, so on. Well, the Rambam has an approach to what Satan is, and I'm going to tell you. I'm going to read it part to you, but a lot of it I'm going to paraphrase. But it's in section 3 of the Rambam, section 3 of the Moreh Nevuchim, chapter 22, and there, in that chapter, the Rambam is reviewing the book of Job, okay, the book of Iyov, and here the Rambam says that. I can read through the whole thing, but instead I'm going to kind of summarize it. Basically, the Rambam explains very clearly what Satan is. Satan, and he brings Chazal that says the Satan is the same thing as the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, which is the same thing as the Malach HaMavis, the angel of death. And the Rambam explains that the Satan is not an angel. He explicitly says, and he proves from the verses in Job. It's fascinating because when we think of Satan, he doesn't come up very often in Tanakh, right? One of the places where he does come up is in Iyov, right? Is in Job, where Satan convinces God, let me hurt him and see if he's going to be faithful to you. So, and the Rambam points out, he actually uses the verses in Job to prove that Satan does not actually exist as an angel, but rather Satan is the evil inclination within us. And now I'm going to take this a little bit further, okay? If the nature of Satan is, if the nature of Satan, according to the Rambam, is our human desires to do things that are selfish, to do things that are, in our own self-interest, and violate the ideas that the Torah was given in order to teach us how to live properly the way God wants us to live, then all of a sudden, that medrash, that medrash with that the Chazal, the Gemara, which I just read about the contamination, all of a sudden makes sense. Now the entire thing just falls away because I'm going to introduce one more idea and then I'll explain it, and poof, it makes sense. Another idea that the Rambam holds is that the Torah was given in order for us to control those urges, but channel our humanity in a right direction. If we follow God's rules, we read this ourselves last week, where the Rambam says God gave us these rules because he wants us to have a good society. He wants us to get along with each other. He wants us to practice, the values that the Torah was given for. All of a sudden, if the Nachash, the snake, is Satan, in other words, Eve's desire to eat and bring the apple within herself, right? I say apple. I know it wasn't an apple, but the image is so in our mind. The fruit, whatever it was, right? It was the metaphor of sexual intercourse makes sense. She was taking, by giving in to her own desires and bequeathing that nature. The nature of selfishness, the nature of not wanting to follow the rules, right? She had it all. She had everything, and God only gave her one simple rule. But to do that, right, just simply out of desire, that is something that all of humanity inherited from her. The Torah at Sinai was given in order to get us out of that. Now, all of a sudden, the Talmud is basically saying that we're all not contaminated in some sense that there's some, I'll use the term original sin that we're tameh, but we all have within us the possibility of taking our human urges and going in the wrong direction with them. And the purpose of the Torah was to purify us. Therefore, Gerim, right? someone who converts to Judaism. And in this case, it doesn't necessarily have to mean someone who converts to Judaism. We know from Chazal all over the place that any person who lives a good life, who follows the rules that God gave us to follow, he or she doesn't have that contamination. They are freed of that. All of a sudden, something which sounded so awful makes sense. And the Rambam says, that's why he said, if you think about it and you search around in my book for all the hints, which I kind of just did for you, right? All of a sudden, a chazal which sounds so crazy, it sounds awful on so many levels. It sounds hateful, hurtful. All of a sudden, it's beautiful, and it's wonderful, and it has so much wisdom. So this is what the Rambam is going to do for us throughout this book, right? That's what he meant. This was. Had he written that book that he very unfortunately didn't write, obviously I can't say that this is exactly what he would have written, but having gone through the Maimonides several times, I can tell you that something along these lines would have been the way the Rambam would have explained that Chazal, and the way he does for each and every problem that he does deal with. Now I want to do the same thing for a pasuk, for a nevuah. This would be a little shorter and a little simpler, but it's still beautiful. And because I am a huge fan of Isaiah, who's my favorite prophet, so I picked where the Rambam deals with a verse in Isaiah, which is not super well known, but it's in chapter 34 of Isaiah, verse 17. And basically, I want to go through a little bit beforehand. In that chapter, Isaiah is talking about how in the future, one day, all those nations or people who rejected God, who made his people suffer, who caused a suffering and so on, all of those people are going to be punished, right? So Isaiah is not a big on punishment, but he does make it very clear that one day there will be justice, and those people will suffer. And those societies which thrived on injustice will be destroyed. And Isaiah, several locations actually uses this image of when God gets rid of people, when he destroys a nation, it gets taken over not by, in other images you find, it gets taken over by a conqueror. In Isaiah, almost every time, and this chapter is beautiful in chapter 34, in the sense when God destroys people, nature takes over. Animals, trees, forests, that's what happens. That's who gets the land when a society is destroyed in Isaiah's mind. I one day, maybe if I have time, I want to write a little book about how Isaiah can even be looked at as one of the first environmentalists. But here, Isaiah is talking about the destruction of the evil nation of Edom. And he says in verse 11, I'm going to read from there, V'yireshua ka'at v'kipod, and owls and jackdaws will then inherit the land after Edom is destroyed. V'yanshof v'orev, and the ravens and the big owls, Yishkenuva, will dwell there. V'nata Allah hakav, and God will measure it, or he will stretch over it, the kav, the line of punishment, tohu v'anchevo, and it will be no more nothingness in terms of human settlement. Chorav ein shamalucha. People will look and say, there's no more kingdom there, you crow. That's what people will say. And all of those officers and all of the people in charge that were corrupt, they'll be gone. There'll be nothing there. And then what'll happen, what will grow there will be thorn bushes and forests and jackals and ostriches will run around and wildcats and hyenas and goats and all kinds of things will dwell in this land, and so on and so forth, until he gets to verse 17, where he writes the following. And this is the verse that Maimonides discusses. Then it says, he, God, he rolled lots and gave this to them, to the animals, to nature, as their lot. And it was God who divided it up. When he divided up the world, he gave nature this role, that when people are no good, it reverts back to nature. Ad olam yirashua, therefore they will inherit that land forever when the corrupt society is gone. L'dor v'dor yishkenuva, for generation after generation, it will be the animals that live in this place. So the Isaiah gives this image of God rolling dice or dividing up and giving it out. This is animals, this is people, this is nature, so on. Now, the Rambam says, so someone could read this literally, and as if God had rolled lots, or God is dividing up land and giving, you get this piece, you get this piece. The Rambam, the way he explains it, and the Moreh Nevuchim deals with this pasuk in section 2, chapter 47. He describes this. This is how God didn't sit there and make lots and things. This is how God created the world. This is the natural course of events. If a society is destroyed, nature will always grow in its place. Bushes will grow, trees will grow, animals will come. This is how the world was made. So according to the Rambam, Isaiah uses this, it's a beautiful metaphor, although it's said in the context of destruction, which isn't so beautiful, even if it's destruction of people that were corrupt. But the idea that the Maimonides says here is that when you read the verse, it has God playing dice, it has God measuring things and cutting things up. But really, all it means is God created nature and he set the world up in such a way that this is what happens naturally. So those are two examples. The one that would have belonged in the Rambam's book of prophecies, right? And how he would have explained that chapter of Isaiah. And the other, which would have belonged in the Rambam's book of comparisons, the Sefer HaTilum. Now that we have that, we can read the chapter that we set out to read today. I just got to get it open here. The paragraph, and we'll understand why the Rambam decided not to write it and why instead he wrote this book, which is so difficult for us to understand. So, actually, if you don't mind, I want to paraphrase what the Rambam's about to say, and then I'll read. So here it goes. So first of all, Rambam says, I wanted to write this book, but then I started writing it. Well, he says we started writing it, so apparently he was writing it probably with some of his students. But then, as I'm writing it, we realized that I didn't know what to do. I got lost because I had the following problems. A lot of these parables were written in such a way because they wanted to hide the real truth behind the parable, right? Because the general public or a lot of uneducated people would misunderstand those truths and they wouldn't get it. So the reason why they were written as a parable in the first place was because people wouldn't understand it. So they had to write it as a parable because if they wrote the truth, people wouldn't know they wouldn't understand the truth. So if I also hide it, then all I'm doing is writing my book of parables in place of the Chazal's book, the Rabbi's book of parables, and the prophets' books of parables, which are already there. So I didn't need to write that. So that's Rambam's first point. So then, what else could I do? I could say it all. I'm gonna read this in the Rambam too, but I want to say it in my words first, so that we can really understand what he's saying when we read it. If I would reveal all those things, then I have the following 4 problems. Number one, the masses wouldn't understand it. So why am I writing it for all the masses to understand if they wouldn't understand what I'm saying anyway? Number 2, they would think that I was off, right? The Rambam was basically admitting that some of the things that he'd say, many people would find too controversial and they won't like it. They'll think that Rabbi Kapach, in his notes in the Hebrew translation, he writes basically the Rambam was afraid that some of his ideas were on the edge of what was acceptable in the Jewish world to say at the time, and a lot of people would have thought, and people thought it anyway. After reading this book, there was various book burnings where people thought the Rambam was off the path, And the second one is, the third thing he says is, if people don't understand it, I really want to explain this to the ordinary person. This was fascinating because the Rambam reveals, and we're about to read this inside, the fact that because a lot of people read the parts of the Rambam says that this is only for intelligent people, but he actually states, I want the average person to understand. So I want to write those parables that the average person understands, even if the average person is going to understand them on the simple level and they're not meant that way. Remember, the Rambam said that the last verse, part we read last time was that people will understand it on their level. I want them to understand it. So if I explain all the details, it's going to be too complicated. They're not going to understand it. I'm trying to explain it so they're going to understand it. And then, last but not least, the Rambam says, what about the people who think they're smart? Somebody who's a little educated, and he calls them a fool among the rabbis, right? Who's going to who he's going to have a problem and say, why? The simple explanation makes a lot of sense. Imagine somebody, and I'm going to use the example that I used of the story of the snake. I can't possibly tell you how many people have read that and concluded that the Gemara says that Goyim are disgusting and dirty, Gentiles are disgusting, and Jews are pure, and they therefore use that as an excuse for outright racism. And not only do people do that, and they don't even understand what's wrong. Like the people that are listening to this class took it as an understanding, who knew right away that the Rambam has a problem with this. It makes that we have a problem with this. So we need an explanation. And then I went ahead and I told you what the Rambam's explanation for it is, right? But the problem is that there are too many people that simply learn that and take it at face value and don't have a problem with it. And the Rambam says they're going to read my book where I explain the background, and they're going to say, why did he have to go into this whole explanation if the simple meaning is fine with me, right? So therefore, the Rambam said, because of all these problems, I stopped writing the book. I had to stop, and now I stopped writing the book. So I wrote this instead, and where I hide a little here, I hide a little there, I write a little that, I write a little this. If you want to understand it, you understand it. If you don't want to understand it, if you really want to understand it, you got to read the whole thing, and you got to compare, and you got to think, and you got to work. So how many people are going to do that? Only a few people that are willing to sit through a lecture like this, right? So now that I explained to you what he's going to say, I'll read it to you from the Pines translation. You can try to follow along in Friedlander. It'll probably be more or less roughly the same. So he says, I'm going to start again from the beginning, but here Pines starts. We had promised, you know what? I'll read it from the Friedlander because that's what most people have. Let me just open up the Friedlander. I'll read it from there. If you're looking at Safari.
So what section, chapter, and verse are we?
Okay, so we're going back to the Guide for Perplexed, the introduction, prefatory remarks, paragraph 8, and it's like the middle. It starts from in our commentary on the Mishnah. It's a very long English paragraph. The paragraph starts, the degrees in the perfection of men vary. But I'm going to start reading from the words, in our commentary on the Mishnah, we stated our intention.
I'm sorry, what page in the Pines is this?
In the Pines, it is on page 9. But actually, if there's enough people have the Pines, how many people have the Pines in front of them? I see one. I don't know if I could see everybody's hand. How do we do that? 1, 2, 3. So I see at least 3. Not everyone's cameras are on. So maybe I'll read the Pines. Okay, it starts. We had promised. It's a better translation. It reads better and it's more accurate. So we had promised in the commentary on the Mishnah, it's page 9, the second paragraph, that we would explain strange subjects in the book of prophecy and in the book of correspondence. The latter being a book in which we promised to explain all the difficult passages in the Midrash, right? Where the external sense manifestly contradicts the truth and departs from the intelligible, such as the example I gave you with the snake story. They are all parables. However, when many years ago we began these books and composed a part of them, our beginning to explain matters in this way did not commend itself to us. For we saw that if we should adhere to parables and to concealment of what ought to be concealed, we would not be deviating from the primary purpose, meaning we would not be doing anything different than what the rabbis did, right? We would, as it were, have replaced one individual by another of the same species. The rabbis wrote it in parables, the prophets wrote in parables, so I'm writing in parables. What would I have accomplished? If, on the other hand, we explained what ought to be explained, it would be unsuitable for the vulgar among the people. Now, it was to the vulgar that we wanted to explain the import of the Midrashim and the external meanings of prophecy. So remember, the Rambam is saying, and I wanted to explain this to the vulgar. I wanted to tell them, okay? We also saw that if an ignoramus among the multitude of rabbinites should engage in speculation on these midrashim, he would find nothing difficult in them, inasmuch as a rash fool, devoid of any knowledge of the nature of being, does not find impossibilities hard to accept. Right? The Rambam is saying that, for example, if you don't know the laws of physics, then if you saw something that defied the laws of physics, it wouldn't bother you because you wouldn't know that there were laws being broken, right? If a fool among the rabbis were to look at a medrash and not understand the truth, then he may not even be bothered by it in the first place. If, however, a perfect man of virtue, a kind of person I'm writing this book for, should engage in speculation on them, he cannot escape one of two courses. And this is very familiar. We read something similar earlier. Now, let's say you are a smart person, an intelligent, educated person, and you read through a medrash that makes no sense, such as the one I read to you. Either he can take the speeches in question in their external sense, he should take it at face value. In so doing, think ill of their author and regard him as an ignoramus. You would look at the tractate Shabbat that we just read and think like, what the rabbis writing this, and excuse me the language, are ignoramuses. How could they write such a thing, right? In this, there is nothing that would upset the foundations of belief, right? Because he's still, the tenets of the religion are still, and of science are still within the person making this assumption. But when he reads this thing that makes no sense, he'll say it's ridiculous. Or he can attribute to them an inner meaning, thereby extricating himself from his predicament and being able to think well of the author, whether or not the inner meaning of the saying is clear to him. In other words, the rabbis meant something meaningful and important, or the prophet in the writings means something important. I may or may not understand it, but I'm going to try to find out what the deeper meaning is. With regard to the meaning of prophecy, the exposition of its various degrees, in other words, that's true when I'm talking about the rabbis' writings, but this is also true when I'm talking about the meanings, things that the prophets write, and the elucidation of the parables occurring in the prophetic books, another manner of explanation. So that's how I explain what the what the rabbis' sayings are, that there's a deeper meaning behind it. When I describe, the Rambam says in this book, when I describe the prophecies, in the view of these considerations, we have given up composing these two books in the way in which they were begun. So I gave up on those books. Instead, we have confined ourselves to mentioning briefly the foundations of belief and general truths. I'm going to tell you what the basic principles and basic ideas are, while dropping hints that approach a clear exposition. And I'm going to drop hints that here and there that will give you the ability to understand clearly what they really mean, just as we have set them forth in the great legal compilation, Mishnah Torah, where there I laid it out clearly. I think this is a good place to stop and open the floor to comments. But it's a shame, unfortunately, we don't have that Rambam's book, but I am afraid it was wise to not do it, because had he done it, there would have been a lot of things in there that would have been hard for a lot of people to swallow. But anyway, let me hear any comments, questions, and so on.
I'm still confused by this circumlocution. If he feels it's, how can you justify trying to explicate something by making it difficult to understand?
I don't know. I think he was, I get the sense that he was afraid to write what he wanted to write, but he wanted to write it anyway. So he wrote it like this.
Okay.
I think there's another potentially element to that, which is that in order to get to the place of understanding requires a certain amount of inertia and work on the part of the learner. And I'm deliberately calling it a learner as opposed to a student, because one has to, I think part of what Rambam was saying was that you have to take it upon yourself to, one, recognize that there is inherent value and not inherent contradiction in these works. And secondly, that you have to do the hard work of working through that for yourself at some level. At some level, you can't teach by teaching. You have to teach by facilitating the learning.
Well, that reminds me of the argument against Rabbi Steinsaltz's original translation from of the Talmud into Hebrew. because many in the community, and Saul, very familiar with this, said, you're making it too easy for people. You have to restrict knowledge to a very exclusive group of people that have only know about, that have studied this in the yeshiva for 10 or 20 years. And the learning should be limited to that small group of people.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I have a question and a comment. When the Rambam wrote this, was this after some of his books had already been burned?
I don't think there were any of his books burned in his lifetime. I think that occurred afterwards.
Okay. The comment is, last week I talked about the Scopes Monkey trial with Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan.
Right.
Your discussion about the ignoramus who takes the simplistic view of the text and doesn't see a problem because he doesn't understand the laws of physics. Reminds me of a phrase from that trial where William Jennings Bryan was being asked about, how old the Earth was, and he said, I care about the rock of ages. I don't care about the age of rocks. And he didn't see the contradiction.
Right. Wait, I'm gonna hold just 1 second. I'm getting a call from the hospital. Just give me 1 second. Hello. I'm sorry, you can go ahead. Yeah, you can start again. Sorry.
I think that's actually a problem. We see it not only in the Jewish community, but it's more of a problem in the Christian fundamentalist community.
I don't know if it's more or less in one community or the other, because it's a big problem. And the less you educate people, the less they see problems. And like, for example, if you don't teach people the value of respecting other human beings, right? Then someone could learn that Gemara and Shabbos and not be bothered by it. Okay, so we're better than the Gentiles because you didn't teach them to be respectful and to understand the, if you don't understand the if no one ever taught you history, then if you don't, then someone tells you the world's 6,000 years old, well, then it makes a lot of sense. The world's 6,000 years old,
Or to take another example, the people who have always used the Bible to justify human slavery, taking a very, very simplistic view of the text.
Yeah, a lot of those issues, we'll get to slavery a little bit eventually, but it'll take us a while. But yeah, no, these are good points. That's why they try to keep people ignorant. The less they know, the less problems they'll have. Who else? Any other comments? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I just, in going through this, it reminded me a little bit of two quotes from Einstein, that one, which is one of my personal favorites, which is simplify everything as much as possible, but not simpler.
Okay.
Right. And the other is, I refuse to believe God plays dice with the universe.
Yeah.
Which ties into both of the references that, one could argue, really, because in Talmud it says he does.
Yeah, well, he's playing dice. Actually, that's a verse in Isaiah that I just read.
Isaiah, sorry, not Talmud. Isaiah, yes.
Right, even better than the Talmud. It's from
right.
Prophet himself said God plays dice. Yeah. Any other comments, questions, observations, criticisms? All right. Well, then we'll continue from here next week. And I did want to say something. I brought up the snake, and I mentioned the Rambam's view of the snake. And it is the plan for me to next week to start. I'm going to do the Moreh Nebuchim. I'll try to keep it to 45 minutes, take a 5-minute break, and then discuss a topic from that week's chapters from the 929 program. So, which started today with Genesis 1. So, and they do 5 chapters a week. On the Yeshiva Salim Malach, they have someone teaching a chapter a day, but in a quick way, just basically reading it through because it's too much depth. So I'm going to pick just one small topic from the last 5 chapters. So next week it'll be from chapters 1 through 5 in Genesis, and I decided to talk about what is the snake. Who was the snake? So I already told you the Rambam's approach to who the snake was, and that the snake was actually our evil inclination. That's how the Maimonides viewed the snake. But that's a little bit of a giveaway, because there's a million ways to understand the snake, and we'll delve into that next week. So
the rabbi said it's tomorrow beginning at 2 o'clock. Was that incorrect?
Oh, tomorrow? Okay. Oh, right. It's the 3rd. Yeah. I'm sorry about that.
Tomorrow at 2 o'clock. So
2 o'clock on the Yeshiva Sali Melech. If one of the people from Alabama isn't in that WhatsApp group, tell me, and I'll get you into that WhatsApp group so that you can get those links. But if you want to be involved in the 929, then just let me know. All right. Have a good evening, everyone.
One quick question.
Okay.
Is there a book or a copy of the Chumash which is annotated with Maimonides' comments and interpretations? I mean, it seems.
I don't know if there is one. There are several Maimonidean type thinkers that have written commentaries. The most famous being.
I read that the Ramban actually did a commentary on the Chumash, but it was lost forever, and that one was written, but it never has been discovered.
That may be the case. I have to look that up, but it's certainly possible. But there are Maimonidean scholars, the most famous being Gersonides, the Ralbag, but he wasn't the Rambam. So he had his own ideas in places, but there's other scholars that have written,
maybe we should do that project as a group.
Take the more Nevuchim and use it. It would be interesting. Anyway, is there anyone wanted to say something else? I don't want to cut anyone off if someone didn't have a chance to say something. Otherwise, have a wonderful evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Awesome.